think everybody's gotten in case you didn't see the chat, Alana put a message in there. If you're having any kind of technical difficulties, type it into the chat. And as we go along, if any questions come up, your bar down at the bottom, there is an option there for Q&A. So type any questions that will be directed at me, and then we'll answer those at the end of the webinar. And I think we'll go ahead and get started. So hi, everybody. My name is Karen Roberson, for those of you who don't know me. I've been with Oasis now for 29 years, and I've worked with ERP software for just about 40 years now. And today I'm going to share information with you about the period end closing of modules in Sage. And like I said, at the end, I'll answer any questions you have. So as we go along, feel free to put questions in, and then I'll answer them at the end. And if you're having the technical difficulties, please use the chat. And let's see, we're going to go through the proper order for closing your modules in Sage 100. And as we go through, because that really doesn't take that long, but there's other information that's very helpful about closing the modules. So I'm going to be sharing some hints with you and some other information that you will find useful. At the end of the webinar, we are recording this, and then we'll get an email sent out to you with a link to the recording so that you can watch it later or share it with anyone else that might find it useful. And let's see, with that, I am going to turn off my video at this point because I'm going to be heads down and don't want to be too distractful with that. And you should be seeing my Sage 100 menu now. And first thing, I want to talk about backups before we dive into the Sage 100 part of it, because backups are an important part of anything you do with Sage 100 or really any of your software. So if you're not already making regular backups, before you do your period end processing, you've got an opportune time to get a good backup. And the main reason to think about making sure you've got one before you do the period end processing is it's possible, depending on your settings and your modules, that you may lose some of your history. That is the number one reason that we have people need to restore after running their period end. And along those lines, I'm going to show you. See, we're going to start off in payroll. So in many of your modules, in your setup menu, you have options. So like I'm in payroll in the setup menu, I've got payroll options here. And I want to point out, so each of those modules that keep track of your closings, you've got your current processing year and your current quarter. And the other important thing is that you have history. So for instance, in payroll, we have the setting here for years to retain payroll history. So for instance, if you only had it set to 2 years, when you do year-end processing at the end of 2022, you would lose what you've got prior to 2021. All right, so somebody's saying they can't see my screen. As I'm sharing it, is there anybody else that's having trouble seeing my screen? Lana, maybe you could chime in. Are you able? We can see. All right.
Yeah, I'm not having any issues, Karen. All good.
Okay, so William, maybe you can look to see if something got minimized on your screen. Or if you can't see anything, maybe you might need to exit and get back in. Falana, does that happen sometimes?
Oh, having trouble unmuting there. Yeah, William, I would recommend logging out and logging back in and seeing if that changes anything. If not, we are recording this, so I can always send you the recording afterwards if you continue to have technical issues, okay?
Thank you, Falana, and thank you for chiming in, William, so we knew. Okay, so payroll is one of the places where you have to make sure you've got your history set. And a couple of other places I want to point out. So like in purchase order, going down to the setup menu, purchase order options. And so purchase order has something special here. So in the main tab, I've got the days to retain completed purchase orders. And one of the things that will happen when you run period end for purchase order options is it looks to see how many days you've got set here. So it looks at each of your purchase orders that have been completed. And if it's been completed, it looks at the day it was completed. And if it was more than, in my case, 100 days ago, it will remove it from the open purchase order list. Now that's different than purchase order history. So now I'm going to go over to my history tab, and I've got several options in here. So one of these is to retain purchase order history. So the last several versions have a newer option, I should say, about keeping purchase order history. So you need to make sure that that is set if that's something that you want to keep. The other thing that's important is this year's to retain your purchase history by item and vendor. So there are some reports, and like when you're in your vendor screen and you go to the history tab, you see this information. So according to my settings, it's only going to keep 5 years worth. So when I run year end, it will eliminate anything that's more than 5 years old. And then I've also got this option down here to retain receipt history. And so receipt history is one of those options where it stays out there and it doesn't go away until you run one of the utilities to get rid of it. Okay, so there's a couple more special things I want to point out. In accounts payable, in my setup menu under accounts payable options, this one's over on tab 2. So the newer module or newer versions ask you how many months you want to retain your paid invoices. So some of your versions are going to ask how many days you want to retain those paid invoices. The ability to specify the number of months came in a couple versions ago. And then you also need to tell it if you want those paid invoices to be removed during period end processing or wait until the year end. So what will happen is if I've got this set at period end, when I run my period end closing for accounts payable, it looks to see what this setting is. And if any of my invoices were paid more than that number of months ago, then it will remove them. Only from the open invoices. So that's when you're like in your vendor screen and you go to the invoices tab, that's your open invoice list. So paid invoices will stay in there based on how, what length of time you've specified here. And then I also have a history tab here. So notice I have options right here for invoice and payment history. If I want to keep that history of all my invoices and all the payments we've made against them for an indefinite amount of time, I just have to make sure that box is checked. And then that also has a utility, if you reach a point where you've got 30 years of that invoice history and you want to purge some of it, there's a utility in accounts payable that allows you to do that. And then you've got your purchases history here about years to retain vendor history. That is related to the history you see on the vendor screen on that history tab. And then you've got a similar question for how long you want to keep any 1099 history. So accounts receivable has the same kind of options in regards to how many months or how many days you want to keep those paid invoices. Okay, so that was just a little informational for you. And so now I'm going to talk about the actual closing order. So if you'll notice on my menu under the modules, I start with Library Master, go down to Common Information. And then if I hop down here, I've got General Ledger, Accounts Receivable, Accounts Payable. So if I go to the end, a general rule of thumb is if I start at the bottom and work my way up, that is a good closing order. So some of these modules that you'll have don't have any kind of period end. So like when I go to Custom Office, you'll notice I don't have a period end menu. Visual Integrator that many of you have, it doesn't have a period end menu. If you've got Material Requirements Planning, it is the first one that has a period end menu. If you've got Mobility for Barcode, it has a period end menu. Bank Reconciliation, you will notice it does not. Bill of Materials, it does not have a period end. Job Cost does, so any of you that have job cost. Return Merchandise Authorization, it does not. Purchase Order does, we talked about that a moment ago. Sales Order has one. Period end menu there. Inventory does. Period end right here. Payroll has a period end, but that one's a little special because you only have to do that quarterly. You don't do it every month. So every quarter you run it. And we'll talk a little more about payroll. And then I'm jumping up here to accounts payable. So accounts payable has a period end menu. Accounts receivable has a period end menu. And general ledger has a period end menu. So like I said, that's a very good rule of thumb. Just start from the bottom and work your way up. And the reason for that is you've got a lot of interaction going on between these modules. So for instance, inventory. If I closed inventory before I closed my sales order and purchase order. So let's say today's November 16th, and I find that, oh, we missed a receipt for October, and I go in and I try to key in, well, I do key in my October receipt, and if October is still open in purchase order, but I've closed it in inventory, then in my purchase order, and if my general ledger was open in October, then that's going to post into October figures. But on my inventory history, because I've closed October, it's going to have to go into November. And you get a little warning message before you run the update about it. But if you just stick with the natural order of how to close, then you don't have to worry about that happening. So many of you have an option. So your modules are in alphabetical order instead of the order like mine is. So for those of you who aren't aware, I'm going to show you up here on my view menu, I have an option to sort my module list. So you can see up here, I start with Library Master Common Information. When I click that checkbox, it puts it in alphabetical order. So it starts with accounts payable and then accounts receivable. So, that's very handy to have it in alphabetical order. So, you might have your checklist so that you can keep track of which modules you've done and which ones to do next. But, if it's helpful to you, you can flip that back and forth. So, it's like you're sitting down, you're ready to do that period end processing. So you can just come over here to this view tab, click that box off, and then here it's in this order, and you can start at the bottom of whatever your modules are and work your way up. And then when you're done, just click that box back on. Okay, so let's See, I told you that that's pretty easy as far as the order of them. And let's see, the number one reason for you to run period end processing with your Sage 100 is to prevent the posting to a period that you have already completed. So that example I was giving earlier, you know, if you've produced financial statements for October and you want to make sure that nobody posts to October, then you can go ahead and close it out. You know, if you find that you have a legitimate reason that you need to go back and post something to one of those closed months, you can reopen those periods. That is perfectly okay. And if we have enough time, I'm going to share some of that information with you too. So let's talk about what all happens when you run that period end processing. So I already went into some of those setup options and explained some of it to you. And let's open up in General Ledger. I'm going to go to my General Ledger options. So you can see in my sample data here, my current fiscal year is 2025, period 5. So when I do my period end closing for General Ledger, the only thing it does for the periods is it bumps this current period 5 to 6. All of the modules that have a period end will do that. They'll bump that period by 1, and that's what it uses when you go to do a posting to know if a period has been closed for a particular module. It won't let you post to a closed period. So you've got to try to make sure you keep those modules in sync so that you know, you don't have that situation I was telling you about earlier, where in some modules you're posting to period 10, but some of them are going to show up in period 11. So then, like I said before, when you close your periods, it checks your history settings. So like I showed you, I'll open up accounts receivable this time. It's looking to see what I have set for my months to retain paid invoices. And then based on that, it will determine if those paid invoices should be removed from the open invoice list. And remember, you still have history. Now, some of the modules, they do have these settings for some of your history files. So after this number of years, when you do your year-end processing, so when you close your period 12, and for some of you, you might have 13 periods defined, so it would be after your 13th period, then it will remove any history prior to the number of years you've got specified here. And, you know, like in the case of accounts receivable, I have this cash receipts history. And then, like specified with your purchase orders, you can specify how long you want to keep your completed purchase orders in your open purchase order list, and you can still have them in history. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about what happens when you do period end. So I'm in the accounts receivable period end processing menu. When I go into period end processing, it's giving me a nice little warning. I've got some invoice data entry in process. So that might be my clue to make sure that somebody didn't forget to update a batch to the period I'm closing. So each of the modules will have this option here to print the period end reports. And what that means is, we'll close this for a minute. Each of these menus above the period end processing, you have a period end report selection. And each module has its own list of suggested reports that you might want copies of. Now, many of you, I know, before you get to the point of closing a period, you've already come in and you've run the reports that you want to keep. And if that is the case, one of the things you can do is you can come in here and you can say, hey, I'm already running this on my own. I don't want this to do it automatically. So I can just click on that line 1, and I can click on my little red X and delete that row. You'll notice I also have the ability to come down here if I've got some custom reports, for example, that I want to make sure run. I can add those to my list. So this brings up all of the accounts receivable reports. And I don't know if all of you are aware, but many of the reports that come with Sage, you can create what are called customized reports. So mine is just the standard, which everybody has. But if I did have a standard one or something besides a standard one, I could choose that. And kind of from the old days before we had paperless office, you could print multiple copies. You know, you've got different department heads that are getting some of those. So then I'm going to go back to my period end processing. So warning again. So if I don't want to print those reports, if I know I've already printed them, I can just simply click that checkbox off. And then when I proceed, it's just going in and it is doing my processing for period end. And when if I do have that clicked on, when I click proceed, based on my paperless office settings, it may print those to paperless office for me if I defined it to do that, or you may get your physical copy. And if there's any of you that aren't sure about paperless office, if you've got that set up for these reports, you know, you can either drop a question in the Q&A and or you can send an email to us and we can help you either set that up or verify that you've already got it. So many of the reports can also be printed after the fact. So if I do my period end processing for AR, for example, and then I find out that, whoops, I forgot to print my aged invoice report, as long as you are retaining those paid invoices long enough, you can go back and rerun your aged invoice report and your AR trial balance reports. So there are a few exceptions. Jump down to, so bank reconciliation. This module, it doesn't have a period end, but it does have your bank reconciliation report. And Sage does not keep a bank rec history. So if you run your bank reconciliation report, and let's say you just print it paper and you don't print it to paperless office, once you've cleared those transactions out, you can't go back and regenerate that report. So that's an important one to make sure that you print to paperless office. Purchase order. In the period end menu, you've got the purchases clearing report. Now you'll notice I've got version 2022 here. This is the most recent version of Sage. It has a new option to print the purchases clearing from history. Many of you don't have the very latest version that has this option. So in your case, when you print the purchase clearing report, it is as of today, right this moment. So if you're comparing that to your general ledger, you've got to make sure you do that timing properly. Then inventory. So in inventory, under the reports, one of the ones I've got is the inventory valuation report. If you use that one, that is another one that is as of this moment in time. But we do have the inventory valuation report by period. So you could specify another period that's prior to current period. But again, this is based on whether or not you've told it to keep your history. So It's really important to check your setup options and make sure you're keeping enough history that you can go back and rerun these reports as of a different date. All right, let's see if I've missed any. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about payroll. So some of you have been running payroll for a really, really long time. And, you know, in the older versions, you got into the habit of you had to make a copy of your payroll before you could do your year-end processing so that you'd be able to generate all your reports. And you had to make sure that you got your quarterly reports done before you ran your first payroll of the next quarter and before you ran your quarter end. So those are good habits. There's nothing wrong with that. But the newer versions of payroll, since it was rewritten, it does have the ability for you to go back and rerun as of a specific quarter. So like my quarterly tax report, notice here, I can go back into prior years and I can choose which quarter I want. So that is only as of the point where you upgraded to the newer payroll versions. So like if you just upgraded last year in 2021, then you wouldn't be able to go back and print your 2020 reports. So just wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that. And your, you know, the other big thing about payroll is your W-2 processing. So you've got the ability to print those after you've done your year end. And I'm going to put a little plug in here. Many of you have gotten some emails about some webinars we've got coming up in December. We have a year-end payroll module webinar coming up on December 6th. And then we've got some accounts payable year-end webinars coming up on December 8th. If you did not get an email, then if you go to our website and then just go under Learn and go down to Webinars, and they're right here at the top. Just putting in that little plug because I know a lot of people like to see those. Okay, and I had said if we had a little bit of time, I was going to talk to you about reopening periods. And we do. So I'm going to go up here to my accounts payable. And I am going to do my period end processing for this so you can see this all the way through. I don't want to do my reports, so it'll take it a little longer to generate. So when I tell it to run my period end, this gives you the opportunity to see, oh, I'm closing period 5. It's going to go into period 6. It lets me know I didn't run my reports. So I can make sure that's okay. So I'm just going to say, yes, I do want to run it. So now when I go to my setup options, it's going to show 2025 period 6. So if I find that maybe I got sidetracked, you know, got a couple interruptions and I ran it twice, you know, maybe I found, you know, we got an invoice in and it was a big one. I need to post it to the past period. It's okay to set it back. And my general rule of thumb is, because this happens a lot, you know, in January or, you know, whatever your fiscal year is, you might want to go back, you know, you've closed your fiscal year so that you don't post, you know, you think you've pretty much got it done. But then you find that, you know, you've got a big invoice maybe that came in and you want to go post it to the prior year. You can go backwards. When you go into your options and you change your fiscal years and your fiscal periods, you can go backwards. That is perfectly okay. And now I could post back to my 2024. I get all my postings done, everything is good. When you're done, don't go back into your setup options and set it back. technically, some of the modules, it's okay, but I just make it a rule of thumb. If I've set these backwards, then to catch up, I go and I run my period end processing again. It will not hurt anything to run this again. So okay. I'm closing my fiscal year 2024 and I'm going to period 1 of 2025. And then I would just keep repeating that until I got it caught back up to where I needed it to be. So it's a lot of information. And I'm going to go through one more time the closing order of modules. Remember, I've got mine set so that it's not in alphabetical order. My library master and common information are here at the top. So to get it in the proper order to make sure that I don't cross any of my wires, I start with my material requirements planning, my mobility for barcode, and then the next one that has a period end is job cost, and then purchase order, sales order, inventory, and payroll is always its own little beast, so that's only quarterly. And then I do my accounts payable, my accounts receivable, my general ledger. So I hope this has been helpful. I'm going to look at the Q&A, see if we've got any questions. Let's see, so somebody's asking, can we save the reports to a location other than paperless office if we do have paperless office set up? So yes, when you do a report, you can, let me pull one of these up. So invoice report. Preview that. So like if I've previewed it, I can use my export report here, and then I can choose how I want, what format it's going to be saved in. So I can do it as a PDF. I can export it to Excel. And if you do Excel, I always recommend you do the data only. Those are the cleanest copies. Needed to. I don't know why. You could do a CSV file. So you can also choose that. And again, from my report menu here. So most computers these days, they have some kind of print to PDF here. Move this up so you all can see. One of my options is to export. So when I choose export, and then I choose my print option, it comes up with the same options that I had when I was in the preview. So I can save it as a PDF, Excel, and whatever I want. So if I choose the PDF and I say to do it to a disk file, then click OK and OK, and then it asks me, where do I want to save it to? So I can put it anywhere I want, call it whatever I want. So answered your question there, Tammy. If anybody else has any questions, type them into the Q&A section, please.
Well, Karen, it looks like you have one question I want to make sure that you addressed in the Q&A. It's, can we save the reports to a location other than paperless office if we do have paperless office set?
Yes, did answer that one. Thank you.
Okay, right, just making sure. So this may be redundant. There was another one again. What order should we use if we keep our modules in alphabetical order? Did you address that one?
So no, I didn't. Thank you. So if you keep your modules in alphabetical order, then you need to go through the list. Like I said, you would start, if you've got the material requirements planning, you start with that one, then mobility for barcode, job cost, purchase order, sales order, inventory, its own, and then you got accounts payable, accounts receivable, and general ledger. Here. see. So somebody's asking, I haven't done any period end activities yet. Can you run through the payroll once more and show what to do at the end of each quarter as far as closing? So as far as payroll, this is a little more about reconciliation than actual closing order. That's okay. So what people typically do is each quarter they'll take the quarterly tax report and they will run it and they compare the totals to their general ledger. So let me go to the last, well, let's see, let me find the last federal. Okay, there was only one page. So my federal taxes, I have this section down here that's got my totals. So I can verify my gross wages, make sure that matches with what's in the general ledger. And I can total up, well, those are my earnings. Over here, move that up a little bit. So taxes withheld is in this section. So I can compare, you know, depending on how you set up your general ledger, of course, you know, it may vary, but I've got my Social Security taxes, my Medicare taxes, and then on other pages, I've got my state taxes and local. So I can make sure my liability accounts total up. And then if, you know, depending on whether or not you've got accruals defined, you know, you may have to take that into account, you know, so you may have to add and subtract some numbers for specific pay periods. And it's a similar thing at the year end before you do W-2s. Just kind of make sure everything looks good. And then I will, and here, my period end processing for payroll. I'm going to do my reports. Typically, especially with payroll, I've already got those reports done before I get to this point. So then quarter end for 9/30. I'm closing period 3, and it's going to open up my quarter 4. And I'm going to say yes. So in this case, because I'm just closing a quarter, the only thing it does in payroll is it just advances this quarter by 1 month. When I get to my year end, you know, it'll advance it to the next year and next quarter, but it will also look at how many years I've told it to keep my history and determine if it needs to remove any of the history. So, Tammy, I hope I've answered your questions. And actually, Tammy, if you would do the, if you haven't already signed up for that year-end webinar, that will give you some more information too. Okay, and I have another question here. If you're behind multiple period ends in a specific module, do you still have to go through each month period end, or could you do it quarterly? Would running period end quarterly cause issues? So you don't have an option to run it by quarter. Payroll is the only one. So you really need to do it one period at a time. So, but if you're not printing reports, it goes pretty quick. It doesn't take too long. All right, do we have any more questions? Do please type them into the Q&A section. And if there's anything we don't, if you think of something later, you know, you can always email us. In case any of you don't know, we've got tech support at oasisky.com, and we've also got links on our website. Email something to our help desk. Well, going to stay on a couple more minutes. If anybody has any more questions, you can type them into the Q&A. And like I said, we'll be sending out an email that's got a link to the recording. And I thank everybody for your time. Hope it was very useful.